saying at sea is because it rocks and roll at sea, that's why I rock and roll on land, along with a little rum, maybe. But I'd like to, first of all, thank Sebastian for playing such lovely music for the Beatles for us. Start off the day with all those titles are somehow appropriate for this particular presentation about Magellan, because in some ways he was the first one to ever go on a world cruise. And it wasn't quite in this style and safety, but I just want to say, did everybody have a good time in Fiji? Yes, isn't that an interesting place? It has so much land. Julie and I went driving around for a while, couldn't find the end of the island, but then we went yesterday scuba diving down to a fantastic reef, out about 40 minutes on a boat ride to some of the most beautiful underwater scenery we've ever seen, with a lot of sort of flower-like soft coral and plenty of turtles and sharks and lionfish and all sorts of things. And so pardon me if a few bubbles come out of my ears while I'm talking here. But today I'm going to talk to you about this great epic voyage, which was famous in the world history for changing the view of how big the world is. All these places where we now visit routinely were unknown until Magellan came. And though he never made it all the way, it was not a happy voyage by any means. But he himself did not survive, as we'll get to, but and he left no personal records at all. He was sort of a hard-crusted, first of all, a Portuguese minor from a minor noble family from northern Portugal, and his name comes down, and actually in Portuguese, Fernão de Magalhães, if I got it right, Sebastian. Magellanes in Spanish, Magellan, and all kinds of other versions in other languages. But he had joined the army as a young man, and he was part of campaigns under King Zhao in North Africa. And he was a cavalry officer originally. And so he got a sense of struggle and the wider world very early on in his career, such as he was born in 1480. And so that was just when the world was opening up after Columbus and the other adventures that went out. He was part of the Portuguese expansion out into the world. Now his journey, in short, left him from Spain, San Lucar de Barrameda, all the way down around South America, across the Pacific, and then he met his fate in the Philippines, and one of his ships made it all the way back around to Spain in a voyage that took over 2 years. And this was a very odd combination of forces at the time, because Magellan tried to get the sponsorship of his own king. This was Manuel I at the time. But at the time the Portuguese were going around Africa and the Indian Ocean all the way to Malacca and extending to the east, they did not really want to go to the west as the Spanish had, because there had been a judgment that the Spanish would have what was to the west and the Portuguese would have all that's to the east. Now here's the seal of the King Manuel with Europa on the right and a native from somewhere on the left. And so that meant that Portugal was destined to be the first nation to go out into the world and explore and maybe settle somewhat. Of course, there were not many Portuguese. They were more the adventurers and traders, but they were not really colonists in the sense of having a larger population to go out and settle any place. And the old saying in Portuguese was, we have a small country to come from, but we have a great world to die in. And so many would go out, and somewhat still in the national character of Portugal, that it's a maritime nation, and many of the men would go out and never come back. Thereby, if you know the fado, the Portuguese lament song about the missing at sea. But Magellan, he went out as an officer under Alfonso de Albuquerque, and that name lives on, particularly in my home state of New Mexico. I was born north of Albuquerque, but this Duke of Portugal went and sent forces to attack Hormuz, which is now in, of course, Iran, and set up the Portuguese colony of Goa, and then Malacca, and then all the way to Macau. And so this was the great leader that Magellan was trained under. So he went out all the way to these places, Cochin and then eventually the empire stretched around the world. But this was the first incursion into the real Far East by any European power. The Isle of Goa, where I'm sure many of you have been, was until just recently a Portuguese colony like Macau. And so this was part of a great international trading network, as symbolized here with the old synagogue in Cochin, India, Kerala. So this was very dramatic how these Europeans would come in their floating clouds, is one of the expressions for these great, well, they're not giant, but they were a sail vessel that could go so far around the world. And this happens to be a Japanese painting of one of the Portuguese ships coming in to Nagasaki, where they had a trading post for many centuries. And so this is a Japanese eye view of the Portuguese merchants and adventurers coming into the court, riding an elephant, which does not exist in Japan. I don't know how they fit that on the ship, but they carried their leader this way. And so this is probably Malay servants to Albuquerque. But the real goal were the Spice Islands. This was back in the days when peppercorns and nutmeg and other cardamom and other spices were so valuable that many adventurer was lost to try to get to the islands in what are now off the Sulawesi Sea in Indonesia. And there they have the kind of climate, volcanic soil, and the ecosystem. So to this day, those are still the major islands where they have great groves for pepper and nutmeg and such. A pound of pepper was worth more than a pound of gold back in those days. And so this led to the kind of economic competition between Spain and Portugal, and later the Dutch and the English and others followed to find these islands. So this is the Molucca Islands with, you might see that there are Portuguese flags claiming the various ones. And this was due to the judgment by Pope Leo that there would be a line called the Línea de Tordesillas, which is after the treaty that was signed between the Spanish and the Portuguese, that there would be this longitude right off the coast of Africa. Everything to the west would be Spanish, everything to the east would be Portuguese. Problem is that back in those days, they didn't know how big the world was, and leagues, as the measurement at sea, varied between different countries. So we have Brazil speaking Portuguese because the line, when it was geographically determined as it is, it cut through what is South America and then gave Brazil to the Portuguese. On the other side of the world, they were wondering where that line fell to, which would take whatever islands. Meanwhile, this was just a curiosity at the time. The Pope could just divide the world in half between his faithful Catholic nations in spite of what anybody else thought anywhere else in the world. Later to be challenged, of course, by the English and Dutch and other traders that did not follow that edict. In Spain at the time, a Habsburg ascended to the throne of the many countries in Europe that were under that rule. Charles V, who spoke no Spanish, he worked in French, and he came at 18 years old to Madrid and wanted to, let's say, do things his own way. And Magellan, when Charles V was put on the throne, Magellan thought, well, maybe this young man will listen to my proposal to sail around South America and find the Spice Islands by sailing to the far west. I mean, Columbus and the others had just gone to the Caribbean and along the Atlantic shore, but he insisted that there was a way around South America, and that would open up that whole other unknown part of the world to the interests of Spain at this time. At the early times, the world was conceived as, let's say, more of a philosophical quality rather than geographic. So this is an old medieval map of what they call the Oceanus Fluvius. It was around all the continents. But back in the Middle Ages, they only had Europe, Africa, and Asia. They didn't know that there was a whole other continents and other big seas, let's say. And a lot of it was a kind of a spiritual view of the world with Jerusalem at the center of the continents and then the other seas around it. And this was later, so America, the continent, finally got on these charts. But there were other hints from other cartographers. This is an Italian Venetian map from 1459 of of a priest called Framaro. But it shows on the bottom of this illustration that there was a way around Africa. Later, the Portuguese went that way. But again, we don't know how this map came in earlier than Vasco da Gama, and others went around the end of South America, rather Africa. And it may have been Arabic traders or perhaps Chinese traders that had circumnavigated or less past the Cape of Good Hope at the time. And later cartographers would draw the coast of Brazil, that's Africa, this is a north up map. And then the cartography presumed there was a Terra Australis, a tropical, perhaps, land that was far south to balance out the rest of the world. And then this particular chart on papyrus that's at the Topkapi Museum in Istanbul shows the coast of South America. Now this time, south is actually to the right. And Pirit was the admiral of the Turkish Ottoman fleet. But this chart from 1512 predates Magellan on his voyage by about a decade, and it shows all the way on the end of it a tip of South America, and including what seems to be ice illustrated with a felucca, kind of a ship down there. Now this is drawn before Magellan was there, but he must have heard about this, if not seen it. Now these sort of charts were very much of a state secret or kept by the navigators as proprietary knowledge. But the question is, who knew about this before Magellan? Well, anyway, Charles V was so interested that he did commission the expedition and signed documents. This is Magellan's own signatures on some other documents at Cochin and Sevilla in October 1518, when the expedition was finally chartered to leave from Sevilla. Back at that time, and I know many of you have been there, the river was navigable. So right in downtown Sevilla, there were ships of a certain size that could come in, and the old saying about Sevilla was, if one had not been there, one would know no wonder. That had been bringing in all of the riches of plundered from the Americas and building the great cathedral in the wealthy city of Sevilla at the time. The House of Huro, which was a Belgian banking family, was provided the immediate cash for the expedition. The problem is they couldn't find enough sailors who wanted to go on an expedition that would probably be the end of their life out into the unknown. But they gathered 5 ships called the Nau in Portuguese, which is a heavy, commercially built for carrying goods rather than a warship, with a lot of room for storage, sort of like Cook's Endeavour, a lumbering tall ship. And they took on 277 sailors, mixed Portuguese, Spanish. They had an Englishman called Andrew of Bristol. They had a few what they call Moors, which may have been African or Arab sailors that signed on. And so from the very beginning, this fitting of this expedition meant that they had a multilingual and national crew members who did not necessarily get along. They were provided with minimal stores. They thought they would re-provision in Brazil. And one writer said that these ships were so old they had ribs as soft as butter, and they would have a hard time even getting over to Brazil, much less around wherever they were going. Now, back in those days, you had a navigation based on sighting, celestial navigation. They did not know longitude at all at the time. That was all done by dead reckoning or deduced keeping of a log. But they did have the compass, the great Chinese invention that had been spread through Europe and made this age of exploration possible. This is the personal compass of Magellan himself, as drawn by Pigafetta, the Italian log keeper who was assigned by the Medicis to keep a careful log of this particular expedition. And of course it has what they call the windrows of the Mediterranean, with the names of all the winds in the Mediterranean, the Sirocco and the Ostro, the Potente, the Greco, and all those, but those were names for the seasonal winds in the Mediterranean. And then it had a flag as a wind vane when it was out on deck, with a motto of Magellan called humilitas. And the one thing he was not very humble. He was a kind of a fearsome commander who showed no mercy to anyone, and got none himself finally. Well, this is Pigafetta, who miraculously survived this whole trip. There were only 17 sailors who made it back out of 277. And Pigafetti was one of them. I guess he was hiding in his suite the whole time when all the trouble happened, drawing his illustrated logbook, and I'll show you some in a minute. But meanwhile, those who went out into the sea were not doing it for pleasure. And this is Gustave Doré's view of what it's like out at sea, if not on our deck. And the ships would go out into the tropical waters when they left Spain, got off the Canary Islands, and then they would end up in the doldrums, which are the 10-degree latitude equatorial zone where the winds are diminished and the trade winds are not there for the ship. But at that point, they had what's called St. Elmo's fire, which is static electricity that builds on the rigs and lights up the vessel, particularly in the night, and that's considered a sign from God that the voyage will be successful. Well, the problems began with one of the ships wanted to turn back. They didn't think they were going to get even past the doldrums. So at this time, they had 5 ships, the Trinidad of Magellan under his command, the flagship San Antonio, which was the largest ship with most of the supplies, run by Captain Juan de Cartagena, who happened to be the illegitimate son of the Bishop of Madrid, who got the assignment. Then the Concepcion with Captain Luis de Mendoza, the Victoria with Gaspar de Quesada, and then the smallest sort of a scout ship called the Santiago, which was the only one that had a Portuguese captain, a João Sarau. Well, they made it down the coast all the way to Brazil, and you see the arrows off there between Africa and Brazil. That's called La Volta, where the winds turn from the east and will blow a vessel to the west. If you get caught in the Gulf of Guinea, south, what is now Nigeria and all that, that was another doldrum where a ship would founder with lack of supplies. So the Portuguese knew that they'd take La Volta to the west, and then they could take winds around Africa. But in this case, the ship went down to what's now Rio de Janeiro. And this, of course, was an undeveloped place in a tropical paradise, if the tropics are a paradise. So they arrived on Christmas Day in 1519. And then the crew was in a better mood after they were there. On the way there had been a semi-mutiny, and it was suppressed by the sergeant at arms. And they accused one of the Spanish sailors of sodomy, which was a capital crime back then on a ship. And they hung him on one of the ships. And so there was a lot of dissension in the crew to begin with, and it was getting worse. But then Magellan had to demand that they leave Guanabara Bay and Rio de Janeiro, head south into the southern summer. And at this point, they could see the Southern Cross as they went down the coast of Brazil to Argentina by January of 1519. This is an illustration of Vespucci sighting the Southern Cross, and you may have heard it from your bill that the Southern Cross in the horizon to the far south will pick up, and when it is standing as a cross, that is true polar south as an indicator. But the Europeans thought this was a sign from God that they were meant to come here and things would be full of provenance. And as they went down the coast, they found it much more barren. Those of you who've been down to Patagonia on the Argentine side, you know it's a desert with very few people there, and especially back then. But they met people they called the Patagonas, which were, they said, were very large people compared to them. Though there was a popular novel at the time which had a kind of a big supersized human that was popular in Europe called Patagon, so that may have named these people after them. They were living in simple huts, and they were quite friendly. They did capture one to take along to help find the way down the coast, even though these Native American people had never been out to sea, let's say. They arrived at a bay in what's now southern Patagonia, Argentina, called San Julian, and there they had Easter service on April 2nd of 1520. And they had a scout ship go down to see if they could find more on the coast, but that was wrecked. This was the Santiago, and the sailors hiked back over to where the other fleet was anchored in this bay. And on Christmas Day, Magellan went ashore, set up an altar with the priest, and bless the expedition, but there was, at this point, a full-out mutiny where Mendoza and Cartagena demanded to go back to Spain. They were not going to go further into what was getting to be rough weather and obviously the stormy place that it is to this day. And so Magellan sent the sergeant of arms to Mendoza's ship to talk about this, but the Esponza took out his rapier and killed Captain Mendoza on the spot for mutiny. They took his body ashore, they decapitated him, and they put his head on a spike, and then Magellan condemned 44 of the crew and the other Captain Cartagena to death. And then he, let's say, we will sort this out when we finish our expedition, but we must go on. And so this was a pretty bad omen, I'd say, for the whole expedition. They encountered other natives that weren't friendly, and they weighed anchor, and they went out, and they finally came down the coast to the point of the Strait of Magellan, called after at the very tip of Tierra del Fuego, and that was at that time, and still on charts they called the Cape of 10,000 Virgins, because it was on the saint's day of St. Ursula when they arrived there. And this is a place where I'm sure many of you have been, where you have rough weather even in the summertime. And they also saw that there was salt water coming out of the strait. They had been up at the Rio Plata, and of course it was fresh, muddy water coming out. But they came here and they realized this must be a way around the continent. There are also whale bones up on the beaches and things that show that sea mammals will come into this area, where they're perhaps on migration. And so they entered this, and it took them over a month and a half to get their way through all of the different passages and straits with contrary winds from the west. And this is still challenging if you're in a sail vessel to go anywhere around this area. But they spent quite a while coming in, sounding, sending boats ahead, seeing which way the passage would lead. One of the ships, the San Antonio, upped and left in the middle of this and went with the wind and went back to Spain. And then the crew there accused Magellan of murder of the Captain Mendoza, and also the even greater crime, he left the Catholic priest ashore. And so at this point, Magellan was realizing that he better continue the expedition. Otherwise, if he went back, he would be in great trouble with the crown at the least. So he went on, and as they went through the Straits of Magellan, they met the native Tierra del Fuegians, who are a number of different groups that are now all assimilated or extinct, the Yuma or the Yamama. But they lived in boats where they had a fire in their boat. They had fires always burning on land. That's why it's called the Land of Fire. And they lived off the sea, fishing and catching seals. They would rub their mostly naked bodies with seal blubber to stay warm in this cold and wet environment. And the sailors also drew pictures of some of the strange animals they have down there, the emu, the llamas, they call them the camels without a hump, the big sea lions, the lobo de mar, they call them, penguins, they called pato sin alas, which is the duck with no wings, and numerous other strange sights for Europeans when they first came down through here. So they continued through the straits. You can see the track of them coming and going into very Useless Bay, Admiralty Sound, and around. Then they finally came past the greater Andes ranges, which come descending down right into the sea there. It's one of the more dramatic places. And for some of the sailors, they had never seen glaciers and ice like this, much less had to sail their way through it. And so this was a pretty dramatic experience after having been out there in the tropical seas and not knowing where they were going. And you can go now there these days through the same straits, and this is the very Cape Ford, the end of mainland South America, right there off the Straits of Magellan. But again, it's very blustery. You have strong currents. It's very difficult to get through there without a pilot and the modern aid to navigation. Some ships don't quite make it. This was a cruise ship I used to work on, but they were, let's say, decided to go too close to land. Well, if you get out on Cape Ford, there's what they call the English Strait, or the Estrecho Elisabetano, that goes right through to the Pacific. Now, this is the great change in world cartography that they did find there was a way around the great continent of South America, and various charts for European navigators came out with this knowledge and led to many more people coming around that way. Here's another one where you can see on the south end of it, Tierra del Fuego was just called another part of the continent. They had not gone around to Cape Horn yet. It was Sir Francis Drake who first sighted Cape Horn when he went around, and he didn't want to go through the strait for fear of the Spanish that were guarding the strait. So it became known, and it was then Cape Horn. Many ships went all the way around rather than get caught up in all of the complicated coastal navigation through the strait itself. So these are various maps of the area. Staten Island was discovered up there off the top of the screen. There's no ferry to it, unfortunately. And this is Cape Horn itself, which is actually a series of rocks and clustered pinnacles out there. They're called the Devil's Beard, because the weather in much of the year is so rough that it is the great graveyard of the sea. Over 1,000 ships and 10,000 sailors have died right off of that part of water trying to beat their sail vessels up against the westerly winds. Well, Magellan, though, came through, and on November 28th, he came out into the Pacific, and it was a calm day, so that's where he called it Mar Pacifico. And at this time, he had 3 ships, which were his vessel, the Trinidad, the Concepcion, and the Victoria. And so they went on up the coast of South America. There is a Humboldt current, and winds will take you right north from there. And they came and sighted land here and there, particularly the San Fernando Islands, where Robinson Crusoe is said to have been. And then he tracked on the southern hemisphere trade winds to the west. And at this point, he entered the Great Pacific, as I said before, so the great blue blinking eye of the earth. And so he thought he was near Asia and that the islands would be coming soon. But he took 99 days to get to landfall where there were any humans. He did stop in the Tuamotus, those low reefs as part of French Polynesia, where he loaded on coconuts and some fresh water, but he met no one. And on this voyage, he thought that all of his calculations were wrong. He was said to have taken his nautical charts and stomped on them, saying they're all unreliable. Meanwhile, his crew was stripping off chafing leather off the rig to eat. The Patagonian that had been taken aboard died. Many of his crew died on this particular way until they reach Guam, which is on the far end, all the way over before you get to the Philippines. And this is where the Journal of Pigafetta describes this island where canoes came out and all these people swarmed on the ships, and they came up and they immediately started taking stuff. That's why, and to this day in Spanish, it's called the Isla Ladrones, the island of thieves. And this is how the journal was painted and written in actually French. And so this describes some detail about these people. The crew and had to throw them in the water and get them off the boat. And they didn't land there because these people were just so rapacious there. But now they were entering an area of the Asian waters where there was, for thousands of years, trade along from Japan, Korea, China coast, Okinawa to Luzon and all the Philippine islands down to Malaysia. And at this point, Enrique, the manservant that Magellan had engaged as his personal valet when he was with Albuquerque and Malacca, almost 8 years earlier on an expedition. He was with Magellan all the way around and came to this area, and he could talk to the people in Bahasa Malay, which is the common language through all of these islands in Southeast Asia, where even if you have a whole different culture, you speak that kind of pidgin language of trade. And this was where Enrique began to discuss where they are, how to go, and they came into the Philippines and met a number of people. They came to what is Cebu, and the ships continued down all the way into the Banda Sea, and finally the one that came back came across the Indian Ocean. But when they were in the Philippines, they met people who were fully tattooed and rather exotic to the Europeans, who were probably overdressed with their cold weather clothing. But this is written in Pigafetti's journal about how the men would wear bells upon their private parts to dance for the women to make friends. We're not allowed to do that on this ship, though. And of course, this is a turning point for the expedition, because Magellan had come all the way and he had a reduced fleet, some very sick crew, and they finally landed in Cebu with the Visayans, and they were reprovisioned and welcomed. And the Raja Hamuban, who was the king in April of 1521, acceded to Magellan's request to become a Christian and to become a vassal to King Charles and the great empire that he represented. And so this was a point where Magellan turned from explorer and maybe a commercial-minded man into a missionary. And Humabon agreed to this, and this was the initiation of Christianity in all of Asia, but especially in the Philippines, which remains a largely Catholic country to this day. And so if you go to Cebu, this island halfway down in the archipelago, there is the monument to Magellan's conversion of the people with the cross that he had planted there, a reproduction of it, and some of the icons that were put into the cathedral there remain and are venerated as the beginning of a new age for the people of this part of the world, especially the Philippines. So these are sometimes taken out into great presentations. Some of them are in museums. I believe this is at the Louvre, this particular icon that survived from Magellan's voyage. But the ones that are in Cebu are part of a great procession during Saints' Days. Though Magellan was not considered a saint, he was just the conveyor of the religion to all these islands at the time. Now this is Cebu, which is now a fairly large city, but off the side of it is a small island called Mactan. And Magellan took the advice of the Raja Hamuban to say, go have the king of this little island convert. But he was not willing. And so Magellan took his forces and some small boats and a force of his soldiers to enforce the conversion of the people on Mactan Island, who resisted. And they were on the beach with their bamboo spears and clubs and saying, no, you can't come ashore. And Magellan said, well, you will feel the Toledo steel. Well, the Spanish and Portuguese were in armor with heavy clothing. They had to wade in through the surf. They were out of range of their own cannons, and the warriors killed Magellan right there on the beach and hacked him up. And this is, again, a famous incident in the Philippines. And to this day, the local king, Lapu-Lapu of Mactan, has been vaunted as the symbol of Philippine nationalism and resistance to outsiders, let's say. It's also the name of a small fish, and Chavo here told me when you're in the Philippines, if you order that fish in a restaurant, the lapu-lapu, they say that's the fish that ate Magellan. Thank you for the story. And but he is, you see him on, for instance, the badge of the national police and such, so that there's been some Philippine nationalists that said they really should change the name of the country, not after King Philip of Spain, which is his name, but they should name it Lapu-Lapu Land or something like that. But nonetheless, Magellan was killed right on the island. And here in Pigafetti's journal, it says, Ici mourut le capitaine. He died on that island, and now right there they have a monument for him. And so he became a martyr to his own great expedition. And here's a later somewhat glorification of him with the banner of the Habsburgs up off the mast, and then the angel coming to take the Capitan away, and then the water sea is on fire here, and then I don't quite understand the symbology of the bird carrying an elephant, but back in those days there were all kinds of things happened, I suppose. And so then the force went back to Cebu, and they had a conference, and the Cebu king realized that these Europeans were not invincible, and they'd also been causing trouble with the local populace, let's say, and had insulted the honor of some of the women and things like that. And at this point, Enrique Magellan's hand servant, valet, translator, in Magellan's will, he had told Enrique that he would be a free man if Magellan ever died on the voyage. But Elcano, the other captain that assumed control of the ship, said, "No, now you are my servant." And this got Enrique so angry that he helped the Cebuans, have an attack on the fleet and the survivors of it at the time. And so they were chased back to the two ships. One of them was so bad they had to sink it, and then the two ships went on. In this case, they went down to Ternate, the island, with all the spices, and they loaded up. They decided to split up. The one sailed north to try to go back to the Americas on the trade winds and such. They knew that the other one, the Victoria, decided to go south and go all the way back to Europe via the Indian Ocean, trying to stay away from the Portuguese patrols. The other ship was captured by the Portuguese, and that provided some evidence in later inquiries. So then the Victoria went all the way down through all these uncharted seas with some local assistance here and there, and then continued all the way down to Cape of Good Hope and up to the Cape Verde Islands, and then up to the Azores. In the Azores, they were so exhausted and down to, let's say, 17 men, and they dropped anchor. They went into one of the ports there, and they traded a bag of pepper for food. And the Portuguese officials there realized this must be a survivor from the expedition, and was going to seize the ship, but they weighed anchor and went back and ended up in Sevilla at San Lucar on September 6, 1521. And the ship limped into the harbor. They were taken to Sevilla, and these ragged few sailors led by Captain Elcano did a kind of a pilgrimage to the cathedral in Sevilla just to pray for their lost mates and thanks for their survival. And so this ship, the Victoria, was considered the first ship to ever go around the world. The Elcano, the leader, was vaunted, and he was said to be the first circumnavigator. And in Latin it says this is the ship that went first around the world under the command of Magellan initially, who found the great strait that's named after him, and also the Victoria, the ship that with its sails and its abilities and glory battled with the sea, the Pugna Mare. And this ship is now being rebuilt in Punta Arenas in Chile, where they are fitting it out in the old way and going to go recreate the voyages out of the Explorers Club. Again, I don't know if I have time to go around the world on that ship, but it's going to lumber its way to all the same places that Magellan did as a sort of the 500th anniversary. So Elcano claimed in his new knighthood and such that he was the first to go around the world. And the tall ship, training ship of the Spanish Navy, is named after Juan Sebastian del Cano. But he may have been the one who made it all the way. But the first one who actually went around the world was Enrique of Malacca, and his Malay name is Panglima Awang. And he probably went back to Malacca and told everybody, well, I worked for those scoundrels, and now I'm home after many, many years. So now they have a statue of him at the Maritime Museum of Malaysia. But nonetheless, the history turned on, and it was known that that part of the world was of that size. Again, the Spanish and the Portuguese finally agreed which islands were whose, and then in 1580, the royal families were combined, and the Spanish Empire became the world's greatest empire for a century or more. And we remember that whole trip as the greatest voyage of all when we have things named after Magellan to this day. Someone said, why is my GPS named after Magellan? Well, because he forgot to bring his GPS with him on his voyage. That's why he had so much trouble. But we have the name as sort of the icon of exploration, which is now extending out into space, and all these telescopes and missions are now named after Magellan, for particularly a number of years ago, for the first probe to go and go close to Venus and map the planet. And this is now embedded knowledge of all these parts of the universe that we're discovering more and more in the vein of Magellan's own voyage. Especially we have named constellations after the Magellanic Clouds which can be seen as we go further south. And Bill will tell us more about it. But this is the heritage of Magellan himself, even though he did not make it. And he had his name restored after there was enough inquiry and other information came back. But his own family died in poverty. He had no tomb. He has monuments in a few places, but he was the martyr of his own ambition, let's say. So that it leads back to an old saying about the life at sea. It comes from the Latin, those who run across the sea do not change their souls. That's why we should not be on such a hurry on a world cruise. Take your time. And the history of this is somewhat tragic, but it did change world history to the point. And one of the old Portuguese sayings about this era was, navegar é preciso, viver não é preciso. It is necessary that you must be good in navigation, but your own life is not so necessary. So Magellan sacrificed his life that the world would be known and hopefully better for it. And as T.S. Eliot said, only those who risk going too far can possibly find out how far one can go. And with that, I wish you a good world cruise safely. Thank you very much.